Welcome to the church family that is lifting lives through living love, inspiring hope, filling with faith, and transforming our world. These recorded messages are made available so that you might have additional opportunities to stay connected with us and that you might learn and grow in your faith. God bless you as you hear the word today. And now, the message.
Tita! Tara ba si Tita?
Ara!
Huh? What?
Huh? Lalabala-hi! Jalrimas! Eva! Jadeva! Aha! What? Sibaroba! Yo! Hello!
Horn.
Deva. Abusaba, a poor that no all. Is it about you? Yada da! Yada da! How do you get this out of that? Huh? Hey.
Reading from Esther, chapter 4, verses 1 through 5 and 10 through 14. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes to him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your family's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." May the Lord add his blessing to the reading and hearing of his word.
I hope you guys liked that little video. It's from a children's curriculum we use here called Holy Moly, and it's kind of quirky, where they don't speaking any words. But to me, I shared it with you this morning because I think in those 3 minutes it captures a lot of the dynamics of authority and vulnerability that are in this story of Esther. And we're talking about authority and vulnerability because of a book by Andy Crouch called Strong and Weak. This is the third week in the series that we're talking about it. If you are interested, you can go back and watch previous weeks on the podcast or on our website. Andy Crouch talks a lot about these two things, and he defines authority as the capacity to take meaningful action. So authority isn't just being in charge and bossing people around. It's having the skills or the knowledge or the influence to be able to change the world in a meaningful way. And every single one of us has authority. In some place of our lives, we have authority, but also every single one of us has vulnerability, which he defines as exposure to meaningful risk. It's not just being emotionally vulnerable, but it's the possibility that every human has of facing real loss. And most of the times what we use is we use our authority to diminish our vulnerability, but Andy Crouch says that's the false choice because God creates human beings to bear both authority and vulnerability together. And I showed you this graph a couple weeks ago. I put them on a 2x2 grid, and many people, feedback's come back to me that seems a little confusing. So I thought, well, let's just graph today's Bible story using this graph and see if it makes sense. So Esther, if you had to place where she is at the beginning of the story, Esther is born into great suffering and vulnerability. She is a foreign Jew living among the Persians. She's only a few generations removed from when her forefathers were bound in chains and exiled, dragged across the desert to the city of Babylon, and there made to be slaves of the Babylonian Empire. Now, 40 years later, the Persians came along, defeated the Babylonians, freed the Jews so that they could return home, but many of them did not. Many of them chose to stay where they were. But you can imagine the Jews who stayed among the Persians, they were not the elite crust. They were not the top of the pecking order. They were the bottom of the food chain. They were the people that everyone spit upon and looked down upon. And beyond that, Esther is an orphan. Her mother and father have passed away. She's raised by her cousin Mordecai. So she has all kinds of vulnerability, and you can see why she'd want to cover that up. Now, King Xerxes that we saw in the video, you would think the king has all the authority, but the king isn't using any of his authority at all. He's given it to someone else. So the king is really in the quadrant of withdrawing. He's just living in the lap of luxury with no meaningful action to do and no meaningful risk to take. And the person he gave the authority to is Haman. And Haman is up in the exploiting quadrant because he's taken the authority that the king has given him. Instead of using it to benefit other people in the world, he's using it all for his own glory, all for his own benefit. He wants people to bow down and worship him. So everyone under Haman's authority is suffering until we get to Mordecai. And Mordecai is the first example of a human being who is flourishing in this story. And Mordecai, what he does is he exercises the one little bit of authority he has. And the only authority Mordecai really has is he has authority over his own knees. And he refuses to bow down to a false god. Now, here's the thing I want you to see, that when Mordecai exercises his authority over his own body, his vulnerability actually increases. I mean, he makes himself a target for Haman. He puts himself in bodily mortal danger, but he exercises his authority to bear his own vulnerability and the vulnerability of his people. And that's our first example of human flourishing. But like I said, Mordecai doesn't have much authority, not compared to Haman. He can't change the law. He can't influence the king. He can't do anything about that. The only other source of authority that Mordecai has is, yes, he can choose not to bend the knee, but then he also has a relationship with someone who might just be able to change things, and that's Esther. So now we bring the story full circle and we get back to Esther. And she started in the quadrant of suffering, but when she was selected as queen, her vulnerability went away. She joined King Xerxes, so to speak, in the lap of luxury in the king's court, but she doesn't yet have any authority. In fact, she says to Mordecai, I have far less authority than you think I do. Because the rule is anyone who goes into the king's presence without being summoned, that person shall be immediately put to death unless the king extends the scepter to her. And then she says, the king has not summoned me for 30 days. In other words, I am no longer the favored wife. King Xerxes has moved on to some new toy, some new wife that is his preference. You see, for Esther to exert her authority in the situation she's in, it's the same choice that Mordecai faces. For her to exert authority, it will increase her risk tremendously. And at least initially, when that choice and that challenge is given to Esther, she refuses. She'd much rather just stay silent and keep safe. This was the part of the book, Andy Crouch's book, that was most challenging to me personally. This whole relationship between safety and flourishing. The truth is that every one of us needs safety of some kind. We need security to grow and develop. We need to have a place where we know our needs are going to be met, a place where we can sleep and we're going to find food. We need relationships, people who are going to tell us we're okay no matter what happens in our lives, right? We need safety, but too much safety isn't good for our development either. I call it turtle safety. You know, if we are like turtles that shrink inside our shell, anytime some threat appears, then we aren't going to do anything. We don't flourish and become what God intended us to be. You know, the reality is every human being starts in the quadrant of safety. No meaningful risk, no meaningful authority. I mean, that's where Mila started. I mean, we surround children, we swaddle them to keep them safe and controlled, but eventually the swaddling clothes have to come off and they begin to explore their world, right? And I remember when my daughter, you know, I can see her back there, she's all grown now, but I remember when she was a baby and she first started to walk. And the first thing we did was it changed our world, because up until then, you know, we could control where she went. But once she could move, we had to suddenly baby-proof the whole house. Every sharp edge was like a danger, and every object that was within her reach, like we're moving, because we're protecting her from meaningful risk or meaningful action, right? When she was about 18 months old, we went to a lake house to see some friends. And I remember this lake house, they had a big deck outside, and that's pretty much where we stayed the whole time, out on this big deck. But I hated the deck because there was no railing on the deck. It was only about 2 feet off the ground, literally 2 feet, which for an adult is no big deal, but for a child of Margaret's size, that 2 feet was a huge drop. And so the whole weekend, I planted myself on the ground at the base of the deck, right? And all the other adults were sitting up on the deck, and we talk, and I was part of the conversations, but my focus was on Margaret. And wherever she moved, I just kind of mirrored her, right? You just followed her along, because I knew she was oblivious to any sense of danger at all. And sure enough, you know, one time she's walking along, and where she steps, where the deck should be, she thinks, and there's nothing but air, and she instantly fell. But I was right there, and I caught her and picked her up. And I think up until that moment, she didn't even know I was there. But suddenly she became aware in that moment that Dad was there. Not only that, it was fun. And so it became this game, like she would just kind of mirror and watch me go back, and every once in a while she'd run and just leap off, and every time I was there to catch her and swing her and put her back, and that we spent I don't know how long doing that. But I still remember that moment, because in that weekend, my one objective was to keep her safe. And there are times as a parent, I still have that protective instinct. I think my one job is to keep them safe, but that's not my job. As they have grown, my job is to let them experience a little more challenge, a little more risk, a little more responsibility. If I swoop in every time there's a challenge, anytime there's a problem, anytime they're frustrated, if I fix their problems and they never grow, they never develop, it's actually as we move into authority, as we move into risk, that's where we begin to grow. And the challenge of parenting is pacing that development little bit by little bit, so they step further and further of who God calls them to be. The path of human growth and flourishing is always up and to the right. But the challenge for all of us, adults too, is that it's far more comfortable down in the quadrant of safety than it is in the quadrant of flourishing. We may grow when there's risk involved, but we don't like to experience risk and vulnerability. We'd much rather just stay where it's safe. Andy Crouch, he kind of calls it the eternal cruise ship, which, I don't go on many cruises. I think I've been in one in my lifetime. But he says, a cruise is this place where every need, every desire is instantly taken care of. There's no authority, no risk. The most meaningful decision you make all day is where you're going to eat and how much you're going to eat, right? And he says, but that's okay for a little vacation. But if that was a lifetime, that's not how we're meant to live. And so he says, what would it look like if it was a lifetime? And he points to the movie WALL-E, which I know Seth just preached on a few weeks ago. If you're not familiar with the movie WALL-E, it's a movie set in the future at a time when the earth has become so polluted that humans have had to leave, and they've given to robots the authority that God gave us to care and tend for the earth. And WALL-E is one of those robots who just goes around as a trash collecting robot. He collects trash all day long and compacts it into little cubes and then builds little towers with it. And along the way, that's his story until he meets Eve, a female robot that he falls in love with. And Eve is sent from the mothership where the humans are in order to seek out signs of life on Earth. And while he finds a boot with a plant in it, the sign of life, he gives it to Eve as a present. And Eve takes off into, to space, to the mothership, and WALL-E follows along. Now, when you get to the mothership, this is the first time you meet human beings in the story, except they don't look like you and me, like human beings should. Instead, at this point, they're just kind of big blobs because they've spent generations being entertained, giving up their authority and I guess not having gravity either. They've just kind of settled into a lifestyle of endless entertainment and no authority whatsoever. Even the captain, who's responsible for guiding the ship, he just hands everything over to the autopilot named Otto. But then something changes when this boot with this plant appears. It awakens in the captain a possibility of this dream of human flourishing and responsibility, things that he didn't even know existed, and he's suddenly captured by it, except the problem is that the autopilot doesn't want to hand back over his power and his authority. He wants to still control the ship. Anyways, it comes to this big battle where they're trying to get the plant into the tube that would kind of set the ship back on a course back to Earth. And I'll let the video clip that we're going to play take it from there. WALL-E is trying to hold up that tube, and Otto is trying to close it. We'll take it from there.
No.
relieved of duty.
Okay, we'll stop there. If you're wanting to know what happened to Wally after that, you got to go rent the movie and watch it, or stream it, well, on Netflix, I don't know. Okay, hear me out, though. I know this is a stretch, but Wally is Mordecai. Wally doesn't really have any authority. What Wally has is the willingness to sacrifice himself, to bear the vulnerability so that the person who does have true authority will have the courage to step into it. And the captain, I know it's dramatic, the Thus Spake Zarathustra music playing, but when he takes those first few steps, when he stands, it's the first time in the movie that a human being has stood and taken steps of his own power. And we talked last week about idols. If you have given your authority over to an idol, those first few steps of reclaiming your life and reclaiming your authority, they are just that hard. They are just that dramatic. It is dangerous and difficult work that you don't do without prayer and fasting, which is what Mordecai does so that Esther can find the strength to do the same, so that she can step into her full identity, who God has called her to be. We've all heard the phrase, money can't buy happiness. Andy Crouch's version of that, he says, the one thing money can buy is one more layer of bubble wrap. It'll buy one more layer of bubble wrap. I read that and I thought, gosh, how many layers of bubble wrap do I have around me? The beautiful thing about bubble wrap is it keeps you safe. The danger in bubble wrap is it restricts you from moving and acting and becoming who God wants you to be. I think the temptation for most of us is not to go up in the exploiting quadrant. We're not Hamans. We're not going to intentionally hurt others. And neither are we in danger of staying in this suffering quadrant. Most of us don't experience the level of suffering that the Jews experience. For most of us, the temptation is the withdrawing quadrant, that we will choose our safety rather than taking a risk to flourish as God wants us to be. And if that's the temptation for us, then the challenge is for us to take off the bubble wrap, to step into who God has called us to be. Esther makes that choice, and she bears not only her own vulnerability, but the vulnerability of all her people. And it's the exact same that Christ does for the human race. Rather than staying up in heaven with God, he steps into our flesh and he takes on our vulnerability and he bears that vulnerability all the way to the cross in order to open for us a path of flourishing and forgiveness that would not have been possible otherwise. The good news is this: you have authority. God has given you authority. No matter your age, no matter your station in life, God has given you skills, knowledge, wisdom, experiences. God has given you relationships. God has given you the ability to change the world. But that change will not come without you risking something. And the encouragement for all of us is to take off our bubble wrap and step into who God wants us to be. And here's the thing: how do you know if you've embraced enough risk in your life? If your step of faith requires something of you and produces something in you, and that's a step into flourishing. If it requires something of you and produces something in you, that's what God wants for us. Mordecai says to Esther, who knows, maybe it's for such a time as this that God made you queen. I think for all of us, there is a moment of such a time as this where everything that God has placed inside of us and where God has placed us in the world come together. And when those things come together, we have a choice. Do we step into who God has made us to be, or do we step back and withdraw? And my hope and prayer for all of us is that if God right now is putting something on your heart, if God is saying, for such a time as this, I have called you, may God give you the courage to step into who God has called you to be. And in that moment, may you discover who God is, that God can be trusted. The reality is we don't find God when we step back and withdraw. It's when we step into faith that we discover a God who says, I've been waiting for you. Let's get started. I have a grand adventure planned. So we're going to close today with a story. Every week in this series, we have a story of someone in our church or in our community who's flourishing in some way. And today's story comes from Marilyn Berry Stam, a vulnerability that she did not choose to bear, but that was kind of forced upon her, a journey that she had to take. But what I want you to do as you listen to the story is I want you to see how the journey she went through, how the vulnerability she bore, how that now has given her an authority to help and speak into others' lives and to help them as well. Here's Marilyn's story.
I have this bumper sticker in my rear window that's moved from car to car with me, and it says, mental illness is not a sin or a crime, it's an illness. The journey probably began actually with Matt's birth. It took me a couple years to get pregnant. He was very much wanted. He was named Matthew because it means gift of God. February 15th, some days you never forget, of 2004, he and I were standing in the kitchen alone, and something didn't seem right, but I didn't know what. And I just looked at him and said, do you need me to take you to the hospital? And he said, yes. What's going on? And he looked at me with tears in his eyes. I said, Mom, I think I'm the devil, and I'm scared I'm taking all of you to hell with me. So he was there on the unit for 2 weeks. They gave him fantastic care. He got his diagnosis of bipolar disorder and started on medicines. So I, blissfully ignorant, left the hospital with him. He's got his meds. He'll go back to school. He was 10 weeks away from graduating from IU. Life will return to normal. And it never did. He just could not go back to school. He said, Mom, I just can't do it. And that was a tough one for me, and that was part of my journey of learning to let go. When you have a baby, my world is having babies. That's my professional career. You have dreams for your kids. You hear their dreams and hope for themselves. You want to see those. And so all of my kids, I'm just so grateful to have had them and to watch them grow as people and watch them achieve their goals. And suddenly when one of your children's goals is shattered, and I wanted to fix it. I tell people when I teach classes, I see, I'm the president of the Recovering Fixers Club. Because that was my thought. I'm a nurse. I should be able to fix this. And I'm his mom, so I should definitely be able to fix it. And I couldn't. There's a little part of me that wanted to say, no, this isn't real. And he will get better, like when we left the hospital the first time. Okay, it's fixed. And I had to be really careful because even I started seeing my son as his illness because it took so long for it to get better. That I had to remember, he is still, all of my children are loving. He's the most compassionate of the three, and empathetic, and a musician, and an incredibly wonderful, dry sense of humor. And he was still Matt, and I had to be able to see that again. So I think probably my healing has been in the acceptance. This is who my son is. And just finally making my peace with, okay, it is an illness. I can't fix him. I can't cure him. That's how I became involved with NAMI. NAMI is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We have family support groups, which got to start at the end of August. And just a lot of opportunities to hopefully help improve people's knowledge about mental health conditions. Matt has a mental health condition. He's one of millions. And just to be able to educate people and provide support and advocate for my own son, so as a mom, but also just for humanity. The stigma is still there. I think it's changing some. Basically, it's so much when people look at the words they use to describe mental health conditions, they're crazy, they're nuts, they're psycho. My son is near the extreme end of things in this scheme of mental health conditions. Millions of people live perfectly fine lives, achieving their goals, managing their health condition, and they do great. The really wonderful part of this story is 2 weeks ago he moved into a group home on the Richmond State grounds, which is such an answer to prayer. And he's doing really, really well. But it has been a journey in me learning to let go and learning a lot about the world of mental illness. I'm still learning about trust. I think, okay, God, I got this. I trust you now. And then something else comes along, and I realize I have a few more steps on that trust path to walk down. But I have learned that God is truly my foundation. At the points where I felt my lowest, and I just remember thinking, I will never fall any lower than God's love. It's there, no matter how big the depression is.
If I didn't know what it hurt like to be broken, and how would I know what it feels like to be whole? If I didn't know what it cuts like to be rejected, then I wouldn't know the joy of coming home. Maybe it's okay if I'm not okay, 'cause the one who holds the world is holding on to me. Maybe it's alright if I'm not alright, 'cause the one who holds the stars is holding my whole life. If I didn't know what it looked like to be dirty, then I wouldn't know what it feels like to be clean. If all of my shame hadn't drove me to hide in the shadows, then I wouldn't know the beauty of being free. Maybe it's okay if I'm not okay, 'cause the one who holds the world is holding on to me. Maybe it's alright if I'm not alright, 'cause the one who holds the stars is holding my whole life. Father, let your kingdom come, let your will be done, here in my heart as it is in heaven. Father, let your kingdom come, let your will be done, here in my heart as it is in heaven. Maybe it's okay if I'm not okay, 'cause the one who holds the world is holding on to me. Maybe it's alright if I'm not alright, 'cause the one who holds the stars is holding my whole life. Now I'm alive in you, bursting at the seams. Now I'm alive, and I can see you in everything. Maybe it's okay if I'm not okay.